All right, everybody, this is Mr. Herzl, and today you're going to learn about the American Revolution. Whether this is your first time hearing about the American Revolution and your teacher sent you here to learn about it, or whether this is a review for you, hopefully today we're going to teach you about the American Revolution and really some important things that happened there and what you need to know for just American history and for the STAR test. So as always, we have these TEKS here, and these are the things that the state of Texas wants you to know. The state of Texas gives us these so that you know exactly what you're going to be tested over or could possibly be tested over on the STAR test. So some of those things are, as you see here, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Saratoga and wintering at Valley Forge, and the Battle of Yorktown, as well as the Articles of Confederation post-war, and the important individuals during the Revolution. All right, so the Declaration of Independence was a formal demand for separation, but the Revolutionary War had already begun in 1775. So a lot of students get this kind of mixed up. You would think that you would declare independence and then go to war, but actually the colony of Massachusetts had already been in open rebellion in 1775 prior to the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in 1776. And we're going to talk about that with Lexington and Concord. The Second Continental Congress is going to form the Continental Army under George Washington, and we're going to talk about how American patriots were divided between Americans were divided among being loyalists, which meant that they loved England and wanted to stay English, being neutral, meaning they didn't have an opinion, and then being patriots, we say patriots now, but being rebels, which meant that they were against England and we're going to fight against England. All right, so Nathaniel Greene kind of sums it up here. I'm determined to defend my rights and maintain my freedom, or sell my life in the attempt. That's the Patriot side, or the people who were for rebelling against the British. And then you have Charles Inglis here. By a reconciliation with the British, it would put an end to present calamitous war, by which many lives have been lost and so many more must be lost if it continues. So he's saying, if we end this now, we can stop the bloodshed and go back to England. All right, so let's look at the Patriots versus the Loyalists. So again, Patriots are people who want to rebel against England, and Loyalists are the ones who are going to stay loyal to England. So where were the Loyalists? Why were the Loyalists near cities, as we can see here? And you probably have answered these in class if you've already looked at this PowerPoint. We're not going to really talk about it now, but just notice that Loyalists tend to be near cities. They're not in the countryside. That's more of a stronghold for the Patriots. And another question: why are Indians loyalists? Obviously, the American colonies that were in the Patriots did not want the Indians kind of to enter the war at all, because they knew most likely, as had happened with the French and Indian War, that they were going to fight against the people. Indians would probably side with the people who were fighting against those who lived in the colonies. Why? Because the Indians obviously want this land to be theirs. And also the British had created their line of proclamation in 1765, I believe. And so they had, let me pull up my pointer here. They had put this line of demarcation in this area across the Appalachian Mountains. You see the squiggly lines, those are the Appalachian Mountains. And they had said, listen, nobody can go across here. None of the colonists can go across here. This is all Indian land. Well, the colonists had been pushing this way. And it was also one of the reasons why the colonists revolted against England, because they didn't like that. They didn't like to be pinned in here and said that they couldn't expand westward. So again, this was a class discussion you probably had about the advantages and the disadvantages that both sides had. But let's just go over them briefly here. So what were the strengths that the colonists had? Well, they knew the area. They lived there, right? When you look at wars, Vietnam is a great example We went to Vietnam to defend the South Vietnamese, but really when we went there in the 60s and early 70s, we didn't know anything about the terrain. And so the people from North Vietnam who were fighting us, they knew, it was their backyard. They knew exactly how to fight. They knew how to navigate. They knew how to move around. And that's kind of the same thing here. So the colonists have been living here, and they know the terrain, and they know kind of how to maneuver and how to move around. They also had the leadership of George Washington and other officers, and they were the ones who were inspired by independence. They had something to fight for, whereas England really didn't. The colonists were fighting for their freedom here. They were fighting for their land. They were fighting for everything that they held dear. What about the weaknesses that the colonists had? Well, most of them were untrained and undisciplined. They weren't professional soldiers. Back then, most of the world, when you look at the soldiers, they're all professional soldiers. They had a shortage of food and ammunition. Not only that, they had a shortage of just goods. Most of them, by the middle of the war, are wrapping cloth around their feet because they don't have adequate shoes. They didn't have a central government to enforce wartime policies. Let's look at Great Britain and their strengths. They have a strong, well-trained professional army and a navy. America doesn't have a navy. They have a strong central government, obviously, to enforce and force their troops to do what they want them to. They had the support of the Loyalists, which at that time was about 20% of the colonists were Loyalists. What about their weaknesses? They were a long way away from home. They obviously were unfamiliar with the terrain, just like we talked about before. They had some pretty weak military leaders, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they had sympathy of certain British politicians for the American cause. So there were some in England that were just like, just let it be. Just leave these colonists to kind of do what they want. Right, so Britain's going to underestimate the colonial commitment to independence. That's one of the big things that we're going to learn. So they don't understand how dedicated these colonists are to the cause. When you have somebody who believes that their freedom and liberty is being stepped on, those people are going to be much more willing to give their life for a cause than people who may be a professional army. To win, the English had to find and defeat the Continental Army. And it looks like they're going to do that in the beginning of the war, but eventually they will fail. All right, as leader of the Continental Army, George Washington was the symbol of the American cause. So everybody knows about George Washington. He was actually had led some pretty negative campaigns, or campaigns that had failed in the earlier the French and Indian War. And so he was the person in the Americas who maybe had the most military experience. During the Second Continental Congress, he shows up in his military uniform to the Continental Congress, kind of like he's advertising, hey, I want to be the leader of the army. And so, they do put him in control of the army, and he ends up being a good general. Right, so he had to build a professional army and coordinate the militias out of nothing. He didn't have, this wasn't a militia, an army that was already set up. They hadn't been trained. He had to build them out of nothing. Right, and he's going to encourage common citizens and volunteer soldiers to support the war, even when Britain seemed destined to win during the early years of the Revolution. So George Washington's going to fight an uphill battle during the entire American Revolution. Baron von Steuben, he is an individual that comes in mid-war at Valley Forge, but he's very important to the American cause. So he's going to teach military tactics and drills. And a little bit of backstory on who von Steuben was. He was an individual who had fought in multiple wars and ended up in France and was recommended to Benjamin Franklin as someone who could help the Americans who were the colonists who were rebelling and help George Washington. So Franklin recommends him to Washington and says he's available. He wasn't really fighting for anyone at that time, and he was kind of looking to go to a place where he could make more money. And so he comes over to America kind of mid-war, and he really whips the American soldiers, the colonists, into shape. And he does very basic things. He actually writes a manual. He didn't speak English, so he wrote a manual a manual for basically how soldiers should march and drill, and what a soldier should do in camp, and what the entire camp should look like. And these are kind of simple things. One of the things was, he said the kitchen should be on one side of the camp, and the latrines or the bathroom should be on the other, with a slope that's sloping away from the camp. So that's kind of common sense, we would think, but that's not common sense back then. So he kind of gives structure to General Washington's leadership, and he kind of worries about the details, and is we say that he was largely responsible for, the army that comes out of Valley Forge and then ends up winning the war. All right, so what is the American military made up of? It's made up of the Continental Army, which was these forces who had come from all the colonies and come into one. Colonial militias, so each colony had a militia. So Massachusetts, the governor there, or the person in charge, not the British governor, the English governor, but the person in charge there would say, we need to raise a militia, which meant we need as many individuals from farms and the city and wherever to come bring their guns and come and volunteer. And then just individual civilians are going to also contribute to the cause. All right, so differing military strategies between the two powers that are at war here, General Washington and General Gage. So the Americans really, they outlast the British. Anytime you have a military who's coming from a long way away and fighting a war on foreign soil, you have a couple things going on. You have the people back home kind of wanting to wrap it up, wanting it to be done. How long is this going to go on? How long do we have to pay for this? We don't want to pay for this anymore. And so a lot of times the opposing military can say, hey, if we just wait these people out, if we wait until their morale is down and their people back home want them to come back, and if we wait until they realize this is not worth our time, we can win the war. He also is going to defend colonial lands and drag out the war, so he wants the war to go on as long as possible without losing many troops. He uses guerrilla tactics, not all the time. Sometimes he will show up to a battlefield and fight face to face, but he realizes really early on that he can't do that because the British army is much more powerful than the colonial army. And also, he wants to make an alliance with France. And what's really interesting is once we get to the Civil War, the South will do all of these exact same things. They kind of use the colonial soldiers in the Continental Army as a playbook for their fighting. What about General Gage? He wants to divide and conquer, so he wants to use loyalists. And again, they overestimate how many loyalists are there, but he wants to use those and seize property and encourage slave revolts. So the British governors who were there sent out information to slaves to tell them, hey, if you come and fight for us, we'll give you your freedom. And so he wants to encourage those slave revolts. Split the North and the South colonies. He believed that if he could take on the cities, if he could capture the cities and then split the North and the South, he would win the war, because he thought that the South had far more loyalists than the North. Actually, he really messes that up by that whole slave revolt idea, and also some military tactics later in the war where he goes in and kind of terrorizes people, these towns in the South, who then understand that it's in their benefit to fight against the British. And then lastly, he's going to blockade ports to prevent trade. All right, so we begin the war. Remember in 1775 with Lexington and Concord, and this is when the whole war is kind of localized to Massachusetts. So the first major battle of the Revolutionary War was Lexington, and so hundreds of British troops marched from Boston through Lexington in order to seize hidden weapons and cannons at Concord. Paul Revere and others rode and warned the colonists to prepare to fight. So on the morning of April 19th, the colonists and the British fired at each other. The shot heard around the world. So what happens is that no commander wants to be flanked, which means that if you have an army, you don't want the other army who's fighting against you to get you on the side of your army, okay? So you want to fight them head on. And so what happens with Lexington is the person who's in charge of that small military unit that's marching there doesn't want to be flanked, and so he moves on to the green there, and that is when the fighting begins. And nobody knows who shot the first shot, if it was the colonists or the British. All right, from there, the colonists are going to lose. They're going to have to fall back, but they fall back to Lexington and all along the way there. And so the British are going to continue to Lexington to try to find and smash those cannons and the guns. But on their way to Concord, they get there, they do what they're going to do, but then they're attacked. And actually, what happened was that as they were lighting fire to these batteries, what the colonists thought, they were kind of over the hill on the other side of the town, and there was kind of a forest in between them, and they couldn't see anything except for the smoke. And they actually thought that the British were burning down the town, and so they went in and attacked, and they forced the British to retreat and fall back, and the British were kind of harassed all the way back until they got to Boston. Right, so British victories from 1776 to 1777 are going to make it look impossible for the colonists to win. So you have these series of events early on in the war where the British know that the way to win the war is to take over the cities, and the biggest city that they could take over would be New York. New York had this amazing harbor. The harbor never ever would, or very rarely would, freeze, and so it was always open for commerce. And so they knew that if they could take New York, they could do a lot of damage and get a lot of success in winning the war. And so they go to New York and they fight in these multiple different battles. They fight and outflank, again, hit George Washington on the side multiple times, and they just kind of make Washington retreat over and over again. And eventually they capture half of the troops that Washington even had. And so they're going to force Washington to retreat, and then they're going to take these two really important forts, Fort Lee and Fort Washington, and all is kind of looking lost at that point in time for the Continental Army. All right, so they're going to go into New York, like I just said, and burn portions of New York, and again push the Continental Army back. So it's kind of interesting. When we think of war, we don't think of wintering. That's what they used to call it. And we think of a war as just continuing on and on and on. But that's not how it used to work back then. So armies would winter. So as soon as the winter was coming in, in December, they would usually stop fighting. And so that's exactly what the British do. They say, hey, we've taken over New York. We can have a comfortable winter in New York. And so the British commander does that. He winters in New York City in 1776, and Washington is going to be doing the same exact thing, but he's preparing his army as well. And so we talk about the crossing of the Delaware, but we don't really talk about the context with it. And the context, again, is that fact that these troops are wintering. They're not expecting to fight. They're hunkered down for the winter. And so when George Washington says, we need to do something desperate, we need to do kind of an all-or-nothing mission and get some wins on our side. And so what he decides to do is on Christmas Eve, he's going to go and cross the Delaware and surprise these troops at Trenton, New Jersey. And again, why are they surprised? Well, number one, it's Christmas Eve. So many of them are passed out and some of them are drunk. And number two, they're wintering there, so they're not expecting to fight, and they're not even really worried about it. They're camped right across the river from where the colonists are, and they're really not worried about it because someone even came to the British officer who was in charge of those troops in Trenton and gave him a note that said, "Hey, Washington's going to come. He's marching his troops. He's going to cross the Delaware. He's going to come for you." And that officer was so not worried about it, so couldn't be bothered. They didn't even read the note. In fact, they found it in his pocket when he died 2 days after the attack. He hadn't even opened the letter to read it. So they weren't really worried about it. And so, yeah, it was an amazing success, but it wasn't expected. That's why it was an amazing success. And that's kind of the genius of Washington. He knew that there were no rules to this war. He just needed to win. All right, so here you see him surprising, or this drawing of him crossing the Delaware, a very idealized painting, very famous painting. All right, so the Battle of Trenton was the first much-needed victory in the Revolution. He's going to go on and march to Princeton, and after that time, Washington really became an American hero, and he could really do no wrong. For the beginning of the war, American diplomats led by Benjamin Franklin tried to form an alliance with the French. So the Americans knew that they needed the help of the French to win the war. They didn't have a navy. That was one thing that they really needed. They didn't have highly trained military officers to kind of whip their ranks into professional, polished soldiers. Remember, these are just farm boys who are coming in to fight, and so they didn't have these professional militaries. And so Benjamin Franklin's over in France, and he's trying over and over again to try to convince the French that they should jump into this war, and so that's his job. Okay, and the French government is willing to do it, but they needed to see that the Americans had a chance to win. Nobody wants to get into a war when they're on the losing side of that war. Okay, so the French are telling Benjamin Franklin, "Hey, yeah, sure, we'll join you, we'll help you, but you need to show us that you can win this war." And that's what happens with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. They see this. The Americans are going to win that battle, Saratoga, in 1777. It's a huge military blunder on the British side. The British are kind of looking for reinforcements down there from New York to come and help them, and they're supposed to do that, and they never come. Actually, Howe, who's in the South, moves even further south to Philadelphia. He's obsessed with Philadelphia and taking over Philadelphia, and he just leaves those troops up in the north to fend for themselves. And so George Washington George Washington is less a part of that, but it's some other leaders who are up in the north on the American side who do that. One of them is Benedict Arnold, who is a great military leader in the American Revolution on the American side. And then later on, he's going to become a traitor and go over to the British. But he helps the Americans win the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. All right, so here we're going to talk about that. The Battle of Saratoga, it's a turning point. We always say if somebody wants to know what's important about the Battle of Saratoga, what's a turning point in the American Revolution? It's finally a major battle. Trenton was not a major battle. It was 1,500 Hessian soldiers. They're not even British. They're these paid professional soldiers that Britain had hired, and so it's not that big of a deal. But Saratoga is a big deal. It's a major military victory. Right? Again, the turning point of the revolution. If anyone asks you what's important about Saratoga or what was the turning point in the American Revolution, you should answer the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Okay, so after Saratoga, French General Marquis de Lafayette helped train American troops while the French Navy helped neutralize the British advance off the coast. So again, the French are going to get involved after they see, hey, the Americans might actually be able to win. They had this major win at the Battle of Saratoga. Now we're going to give them our help. We're going to give them our troops. We're going to give them our officers to help them. We're going to give them our navy to help fight the British. When French troops arrived in the spring of 1778, the tide of the war shifted in favor of the Americans. Right, American General Horatio Gates defended the British three-prong attack and defeated the British at Saratoga there. So Gates, it's funny that this doesn't talk about Benedict Arnold. It was actually Gates and Benedict Arnold that were doing that. During the winter of 1777 to 78, the Continental Army troops nearly starved at Valley Forge. So, yes, they had had that major battle. They had the victories at Trenton. They had the victory at Saratoga. They had the French support, but they were also at a time where a lot of the people who they had recruited for the war were ending their requirements. So like when someone came in, they only signed up for like a year, or maybe it was 2 years. And so a lot of those people were going home. Some people were starving. Some people froze to death that winter. It was not a good time for Washington. And one of the interesting things that Washington decided to do that they say probably saved him, I heard a professor talk about this the other day, is Washington vaccinated his troops for smallpox. So a lot of the people who, we talked about earlier in this course, the fact that when Europeans came over, they gave Native Americans smallpox because they hadn't been exposed to it. Well, most of the troops that are English, that are British, are coming from cities where there's a dense population, and so they don't get sick as much from these diseases. But most of the people who were fighting in the Revolutionary War under Washington were coming from the countryside. Not that many from the city. More of them were just country farmers and things like that. And so they hadn't been exposed. And so Washington kind of said, I don't know if I want to vaccinate. Vaccination back then was like you had to cut someone open a little bit and put some of the pus from a smallpox victim inside of them. And so it was a kind of a big process, and finally Washington says, okay, I'll do it, and that helps big time. That helps a lot. So less of his soldiers are going to die because of that, and that's one of the things that he does there. But also it gives him time. Valley Forge is a bad time and it's a good time. It's a bad time because they didn't have, a lot of their troops were leaving. They didn't have supplies. They didn't have food. But this actually starts the beginning of building the military up, and that's why Washington is held up as a hero in the Revolutionary War, is that he kept those troops together through that hard time at Valley Forge. So if anybody asks you about that, or if you see that on the STAR test, Valley Forge is a turning point, just like Saratoga, because it's the beginning of not only French intervention, but building up the military and keeping the military together. It's kind of like this. If they could get through Valley Forge, that terrible winter, they pretty much feel like they can get through anything. There's a picture of being near starvation at Valley Forge. So again, it was a terrible time, but if they could get through that, they could get through anything. In the South, after Savannah and Charleston are captured, American General Nathaniel Greene helped defend major cities from British General Charles Cornwallis. So Cornwallis is the British leader in the South. And again, the British leader Howe is like obsessed with the Southern leadership. And so Cornwallis continues that, and Cornwallis is going to be in the South. And they think that if they can divide the colonies, then the South will be loyalist towards them. But in doing so, they wreak havoc. They do terrible things in the countryside to these colonists, and so more and more colonists turn towards the side of the Americans. From 1778 to 1781, both sides traded victories, but the war finally came to a conclusion at the Battle of Yorktown. By 1781, Washington trapped the army of British General Cornwallis between the Continental Army and the French Navy. So Cornwallis he's kind of makes a terrible decision and puts his troops on a peninsula that's he's got ocean on three sides of him, and so he's trapped. Basically, the Washington and Rochambeau come and march their troops all the way from the north and cut him off and cut off any escape. And then the French Navy trap him on all sides of that peninsula, and he has no option. He has to give up. All right, if you click on this, you can watch a little video on the Battle of Yorktown. So General Cornwallis is surrounded, and he's going to surrender to Washington in 1781, and that's going to be the official end of the American Revolution. So America had gained its independence, and they had fought their way into proving that not only was the Declaration of Independence a piece of paper with words on it, but it actually meant something. They were now independent. So Cornwallis is going to surrender, and he calls it the day the world turned upside down, that these scrappy colonials could actually beat the biggest army ever. You have to understand, the British sent more troops to the colonies than they had ever sent anywhere in the history of their military. And so for the colonists to defeat that many English troops was just an amazing, amazing thing. Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially ended the American Revolution, and the treaty gave America full independence, all territory east of the Mississippi River between Canada and Florida. So you can see here, if you don't know what the Mississippi River is, it basically runs right through here. And you can see over here is what they were given. And the removal of the British Army. So the army had to move out. So now it was just the colonists all by themselves to run the country. And so, that the question will be, what kind of country will they have? So you can see North America 1754, and you can see this line where the colonists could not go past here in 1763, and then 1783, this is all their territory. So they got really what they wanted. All right, so that is the end of my lecture here. Hopefully you learned something. I try to keep it pretty short. Hopefully you'll be able to take your test and ace it, as well as take the STAR test and know what you need to know for that. All right, so until next time, hope you guys do well, and best wishes.